So it's been 2 weeks since the Austin Emerge event, and in my experience, its impact is still sending ripples through the various communities I'm part of. People are still actively talking about it, reflecting on it on WhatsApp and in forums. There was a recent lively discussion on Clubhouse. Brendan Graham Dempsey just published an article that looks like it's been pretty well received. It offered some critical reflection, but it resonated with a lot of people. And a number of people are considering offering different versions of the Emerge event at different locations besides the official European ones. And since Layman and I both attended the event, I figured it'd be both fruitful and timely for us to offer our own integral stage reflections on it. So Layman and I have carefully hand-selected a group of radical, controversy-loving extremists who are sure to offer polarizing perspectives and drive our YouTube numbers up. But seriously, we're selecting a group of people that we feel are well-equipped to offer some wise, seasoned, balanced reflections and some insights into what might happen next. I think there's a wonderful group of people that we've gathered here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to share. And I want to recognize up front that the Emerge event really isn't over. There's still the harvesting phase, which is going to be a bunch of online discussions to talk about what happened and what we can do next. And actually that's been ongoing since the event. And I consider this conversation to be an informal part of that also. So we're joined today, besides me and Layman, there's also Ivo Mensch, Roger Walsh, Nomali Pereira, and Ēlen Awalom. And I'll allow everybody to offer a brief introduction. I'd like to ask just us to go around in a circle first and just say, what your connection to the event was, what brought you to it, and if there are any key insights or impressions, reflections, criticisms that you have of the event, just coming away. What stands out most significantly and saliently for you? And then we'll go after that get into the weeds and go a little bit more in depth into the overall process and experience and deeper takeaways.
You said go around in a circle, but we probably have different circles on our screens here. So
I'm happy for you to start, Roger. That'd be wonderful.
Okay, well, I can start very briefly. I think your first question was what our connection to the Emerge conference was, and for me, I had known Jonathan Rowson and Thomas Bjorkman, who are major creators of this. Thomas has been a major pioneer in much to do with metamodernism and the global crisis or meta crisis. And Jonathan Rowson I have enormous respect for. He's the director of Perspectiva organization, which was one of the co-organizers of this. So I have been very fortunate to know them both. And so I think that was how I was invited, and certainly an inspiration for coming. Of course, the main inspiration for coming was just an extraordinary group of people they managed to pull together from around the world. This was an invitational conference, which of course gives it a special depth because one is able to pick people who the organizers feel will really make a contribution. And so just looking across the roster of participants was like, well, yeah, okay, after 2 years, I'm going to come out of my COVID bubble and I want to be with these people. So that was the main attractor.
So I'm Ivo Mensch. I work for Perspectiva. Perspectiva has been, after Thomas set it up, Perspectiva has kind of been developing the purpose behind Emerge. And so I have a bit of a history with it. Also, since this has been the third gathering for me after one in Kiev in 2019 and one in Berlin just last year in October. So perhaps I can speak a bit more to the historical development at some point of Emerging, where I see it's kind of going, and the difference between Europe and this the first time being in the United States. So that's kind of my connection to Emerge. I was quite central to organizing the Berlin one that happened last year. Not so much involved with this, only peripherally with the events leading up to it. I think I hosted 4 or 5 or something sessions like those, and and just one during the gathering. So that's the short version of how I'm connected to Emerge, and I think I'll leave it at that for now. And I was also like super happy. For me already, the main takeaway is actually that it happened. So I think that was the most important thing, because knowing the various tribes, as we sometimes call them, there's nothing else like this yet. Everything else in focus is much more narrow, which also makes it quite difficult actually for these events to get a sense of coherence, to get your needs met with which you enter. There is some the different intentionalities with which people enter, and how that is held by the totality of it. These are some very interesting, I think, dynamics we can probably dive into a bit deeper. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Nomali. Why not?
Yeah, thanks, Ivo. Thanks, Roger. So I think some of the things that Roger said are quite, ditto on all of that for me as well. Just coming out of the COVID bubble, I haven't known a whole lot about the Image events, although I've definitely known about Thomas Bjorkman. I've been sort of following a little bit of his work, and have been really very appreciative of his work. And so I was excited. I'm assuming I got sort of roped in probably because of my history in the integral world. Certainly Roger and Bruce, I've known you both probably 2 decades now. So that's how long ago I moved to Boulder from Sri Lanka for this little thing called integral. And so I just probably leave it at that. I probably got invited due to that history. In general, just really was looking forward to meeting people, and lots of interesting names on the roster, as Roger already mentioned. Yeah, I came with a lot of curiosity.
I guess I first heard about it from Brandon Norgard a while back, and he approached me about dates. And I think I ended up suggesting to him that it not be in May so that it wouldn't overlap with the Metamodern Spirituality events. And then in my private dealings with Bjorkman, he kept strongly encouraging me to participate. But I was hesitant. I had several concerns. I thought maybe this is going to be too much of a fancy international corporate conference, and maybe I would be a bit let down compared to the intersubjective success we had in Vermont. I was worried about which tribes might not be present. I don't know if the Dark Renaissance contingent would be represented, or the so-called hella metamodernists and the metamodern magic and the immersive theater people, all that kind of stuff. And I was concerned that big name speakers might hog all the space telling us what we've already heard from them, and we wouldn't have a chance to harvest the collective intelligence from the quieter background people, where I think it mostly resides. But I decided to go because I have a lot of respect for Tomas, and also because so many of the best people were going to be gathering in one place. And I think it's a prototype in a way that is a bit like the Hajj for Muslims. I think these sort of meta swarm events are going to be a normal part of the quasi-religious pattern of the future. But I definitely had to ponder how I was going to go into it and come up with some strategies, and I'm glad that I did.
We're still waiting for Elin to get here, so I'll say something. I also heard about it first from Brandon Norgard. We had a gathering, a little summer gathering in my city, Concord, and at that he started floating the idea that maybe there could be an Emerge event that was not in Europe, but it was in the U.S., and he was hoping for the Bay Area. That idea gradually evolved, but Thomas was interested in it and pursued it, and eventually it ended up in Austin. I wasn't sure I was going to go or not either. At some point, I posted something online where I had been noting certain discussions that were taking place, especially in metamodern circles, about things to try and things to bring together. And I was a little frustrated by that, as much as I also was interested in and excited by that, because some of those things are things that my university program has been doing for 30 or 40 years, and I've been teaching for a couple decades. And so I commented on that yeah, there's actually been efforts to pull these threads together in some significant ways and a lot of exploration that's already happened. And Thomas saw that and said, you should come to this event, Bruce. And so when I looked at the roster of who's coming, I also decided it was worth it to be there gathered with all of these people. I really didn't know what to expect. I knew it was not going to be a typical academic conference with people presenting papers. I actually thought it was going to be more of an opportunity for everybody to share their own projects, because that's kind of the context in which I was invited. And that didn't happen as much as I had been anticipating, but it was still overall a pretty, fruitful encounter. And for me, the main takeaway was really just the intersubjective time I was able to, spend among so many amazing people. And I think there is more that we can explore about what worked and didn't work. And since Ēlen hasn't made it here yet, I think we can just go ahead to the next question. And that's what I would like to ask first is, from your own experience of attending past events, your own knowledge of creating generative enclosures and dynamic intersubjective emergence, and just what you think this movement or collection of movements needs at this time. What do you feel really worked well at the conference that stood out to you and said, yes, we need more of this? And what did not work so well and that you think we maybe need to work on in other such events?
I can take a quick crack at some of my thoughts that I have about that. What I really appreciated about attending this event was that, like I said, because of my own personal history in the integral domain, for the last 20 years to some degree, I've been somewhat sort of like really embedded in that world. And in the last 5 years or so, as a lot of us know, all these sort of new pockets and new platforms and new teachers and lots of different things have come about that are influenced by integral, whether they say that or not. So it doesn't really matter, but I really have been just loving the sort of, the Game B and the whole sort of Rebel Wisdom crowd and Integral Stage and the STOA and just so many different platforms and teachers and all kinds of things like that. And that was very exciting for me. And then also things that I understand less around, like blockchain and crypto and the whole talk about all of that, AI and so many different things that were really interesting to me. So, and of course, all of it held under this sort of umbrella of the more fancy new term of metamodernism, which, like, I kind of came there feeling a little bit old-fashioned, like the old integral grandmother coming into this new fancy young people, the youth of the metamodern world. So I was a little bit intimidated by that. So I loved the diversity of coming to a place where one thing wasn't the kind of catch-all, wasn't sort of hijacking the energy of the event in that way. I really appreciated that. That said, the flip side of it was that, I was thinking about the old integral theory conferences at the JFK University, 500 to 600 people, just really exciting events, but we all had the same map or same language to a large degree, which was sort of the integral language, that sort of the energy of the integral community, integral grammar at the time. And so after a little while of being at the Emerge conference, I noticed how I liked the diversity. And then I also felt like, I'm not sure what's the common grammar that is holding us together here. Not necessarily that we needed to have a common language necessarily, but personally, I wanted a little bit more of that. Like, I wish that we all had some sense of a language or a toolkit or a map that we were all sort of orienting from. So yeah, I think maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Well, I can jump in just one thing. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of different conversations we can have here, but since you, Namali, mentioned the variety of peoples, that was certainly a draw that I'm already aware, and just a little bit has been said about in the conversation so far. And you've mentioned, for example, Layman, a metamodern spirituality event, and it's like, oh, gee, I didn't know about that. That sounds interesting. And there are all these things that are going on that I'm not so tuned into. I'm wary of signing up for mailing lists and just I can't keep up with email anyway. So I'm aware that the downside of that is there's just a lot going on that I don't catch and I miss, and I regret that. And my hope in coming to this gathering was to be exposed to a variety of people in different worlds doing interesting things and actually very effective things in many cases. So for me, as with every conference, the high point was being with people and meeting people such as, Layman, Bruce, you, and Ivo. I hadn't met any of you before. I certainly knew of all your work. Namali and I have been in the same orbit for 20 years before we've seen each other. I can't remember how many years it's been since we've seen each other. Certainly BC, before COVID. So the delight was reconnecting with people like Namali and meeting people like you, whose work I've been following for quite some time. But of course, it's just so much more delightful to have a personal connection and to be able to talk in person and toss ideas around. And it leads to things like this. So it was certainly the high point for me. Just sticking with the variety of tribes that were present and the richness of the mix, for me, the distinct downside was I should back up and just give a context and say that the organizers chose, I think, to have a deliberately minimally organized event. And there was a line put out on one of the invitations, most of the people who come here are used to being keynote speakers at events, so we're not going to do that kind of thing. We're going to have much more freestyle, interaction. And for me, speaking just for the moment to the different tribes, I would really have loved to have had presentations from those different tribes about first giving an overview of what they're doing, because some like metamodernism I have a fairly good sense of, but others I just, oh yes, I know that name, I know of it. So I would have loved to have some overview presentations from the different worlds that were represented there, as a way of familiarizing myself and basically get an education. And that was one of the reasons I went. I wanted an education from people who have very deep and rich experience in a variety of fields that I know are important, but I don't know. So that for me was a major lack. And maybe I'll leave it there for the moment.
I went in very deliberately to focus on subtle energy sensing and to make experiments of that kind. So I wasn't in as philosophical and analytic a mode as I might otherwise have been. And I'm not sure how much subtle feedback I necessarily want to share. I liked the sense that emerges trying to hold this central space, right? This space that straddles a number of different tribes and can be simultaneously self-refining and outward facing. And that's inherently going to be messy. There's inherently going to be ambiguity about things like shared language and whether or not we can track each other. But it's also exciting. So I appreciate that element of it. I think, like Roger said, it might have been nice to have something presenting or representing the different sub-tribes or movements or whatever they are to some degree, but I really liked the absence of primary speakers. I thought that was a good move, although it was maybe counterbalanced by there being too many facilitators. I think in our group, a third of the people were facilitators. I really enjoyed Tomas's overview. I found that actually much more impressive than I had initially anticipated it to be. It was a really good summary. I liked the inspiration behind the introductions and guidance that people were trying to give on that Saturday morning, but it went on way too long. It was tedious and excessive, and I found that after several hours of mind-numbing guidance, most people in most groups didn't feel they had much guidance at all to go forward in their actual groups. So that probably could have been better. I felt like there's a trap, and almost analogous to neuroticism in a way. There's a trap we get into when we gather to just ask ourselves who we are and what we're about. And I ended up saying to a lot of people over the weekend, why didn't we just build a barn? Right? If we could have done a project, we might have had all the same conversations around the side, but we would have ended up being more coordinated and feeling like we accomplished something and could go forward as accomplishers. I felt like I ran into a lot of people. This didn't happen to me personally, but I heard from a lot of people that they were having trouble navigating their mutual projections onto each other. And they didn't really feel like there was a container or an instruction for dealing with feeling like other people didn't view them properly. Generally, it seemed like a lot of the same wins and a lot of the same failures as have been going on with meetings of this kind for several decades, maybe longer. I like that financing this thing was at least nominally raised. I appreciate in principle that the tech and the spiritual aspects are trying to be brought together, but I'm not sure they actually merge very well, with the exception of, a few one-on-one pocket conversations. But overall, definitely worth it. And definitely, I feel even now that my body is full and saturated by some kind of intersubjective energy that I've carried away from it and will continue to be fertile and germinating. So generally a success. And I think we have the option of thinking of the insufficiencies as failures or as suggestions about how to do it even better next time.
I can pick up unless Ellen, I see you're here. Do you want to introduce yourself? We just had a short round. So welcome to the space, I would say. And if you can't, I'll just continue on building on what Layman said. Oh, good. You're here. Great. Yeah.
I was just grabbing my laptop charger. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Who just asked me to speak? I was away grabbing my charger.
That was me, asking if you want to introduce yourself. We just did a little round, so with first takeaway, so before you joined.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you. I apologize for the delay. I did let Bruce know ahead of time that I would be running behind. I just moved into a new place amongst many other life transitions, so things are a little hectic, but I'm so happy to be here. I know that Bruce had shared with me the prompt with which we began this debrief. So very quickly, I have a very long history as a leftist activist. And previously, in a previous life, I feel comfortable saying sort of an intersectional feminist public intellectual. I don't really identify with intersectional feminism anymore, although it remains a part of the way through which I view the world, and I think still a really important perspective and lens. And also an exhibiting Afrofuturist artist, exhibited all over the United States, primarily visual art, primarily photography. And then in my most recent chapter, I worked in the tech sector for over 10 years, with one of my, I guess, most proud collaborations being the creation of a platform, a social networking platform that was funded by Google and other folks. And I co-founded it with Patrisse Cullors, who is the founder of Black Lives Matter Global Network. So yeah, really like a long history of at the intersections of activism, technology, art, and just philosophy and various intellectual movements in general. And even though I come from a very long lineage, my family is from Eritrea, and my lineage includes almost 2,000 years of Orthodox Christianity, which is a really beautiful faith, Orthodox Christianity as well as Judaism. But because of the changes that have occurred in that region and really across the globe over the last several decades, I wasn't raised in a particularly religious household. In fact, my father identifies as atheist. And so I had a lot of leeway in terms of my spiritual exploration, starting at a very early age, around 11, when I began exploring Eastern mysticism and French existentialism, and you name it. I was like with my nose in the books. And so 4 years ago now, when I was invited very serendipitously to a retreat at Elin in Big Sur, California, I knew I did my prayers and my meditations, and I heard a very clear voice say, nothing is ever going to be the same for you after this. And I remember being a bit incredulous, but I've also learned to trust that voice over the years. And so I packed my bags. It was very last minute. I had been invited months previously, but I kind of maybe a day or two before decided to attend. And that was where I encountered these, specifically spiral dynamics, integral theory, and then Hansi's school of metamodernism. And it was suddenly like all these things that I had been trying to put, all these different puzzle pieces that I'd been holding on to for years finally started to fit together and come together. So I have been part of this community, I guess, for 4 years now, although it feels like on a spiritual level, eons. But that is, I guess, how I came to encounter this community, and part of why Hansi invited me, or well, I called him Hansi, but Daniel invited me. And I'm happy to share more about my background, but I'm mindful of the fact that I've been speaking for about 7 or so minutes now, so I will give up the mic. I yield. I'm Ēlen, and I'm complete.
Thank you, Ēlen. And Ivo, did you want to share anything in response to the, what worked and didn't? And I'll offer, and we'll kind of circle back to Ēlen to answer on that one as well.
Yeah, sure. I think what worked really well was people taking responsibility for their own definition of success, basically. That what this was, not expecting too much to come, I think, from the organizers, from the programming of the event, both because it seemed a little loose anyway, but to me that was actually the great thing about it, that a lot of people made it a success for their own. And when I'm thinking about events for the future, for example, I think that is the main factor to take into account, and actually give people as much space to actually do that, to make these kinds of event successes for their own, especially coming back to Emerge, because it is a collection of tribes, right? And that's also the reason why it's not an organization, Emerge, for example. It's more an interstice, it's a fascia, it's connective tissue, and hopefully there are some nutrients flowing between these various organs that make up the total body of this. It also means it's quite difficult to really come to a definition of success, or beyond, as we said, as an event where people can finally get to meet each other after talking online to each other for sometimes years. And so the variety of perspectives on it, and the difficulty when you talk about coherence or the absence thereof, I think is really a feature and not a bug. And I don't think it's even a problem that we need to kind of really try and solve, although some people want to do that. So yeah, I think to be invited into that space that is, through its purpose and intentions, is interstitial. It takes a bit of a different attitude coming in, and that we're just discovering. It also makes the whole idea memetically vulnerable. For example, if we say it's a network of networks, many people have tried, but the main, and this, for example, felt a bit more like that in Europe, for example, where people come and really have they're carrying their own projects, their big bets, be it politics, be it metamodernism, be it spirituality, be it systems thinking, and whatever else it is that people can cohere around, like the strong coherences, right? So Emerge is it's a weak coherer just by its nature in that sense. So it's quite difficult, I find, to, first of all, come to a definition of success, and then also asking the question of what next. I have some thoughts about that, but I think I'll just leave it here for other people to kind of pick up on.
Great, Joe. We can come back to the what's next question in a little bit. I also appreciated the kind of the wide open approach, the somewhat intuitive trust that out of this collection of people and interests, something will emerge without attempting too much to control what that is. For Layman and I, our integral stage project, one of the things we wanted to do is, have a big tent, invite in a lot of different voices, more kinds of voices than have typically been, just in integral circles, to try to do some of that interstitial work. And it's challenging because sometimes people don't know where you stand as you kind of try to move between these different tribes. But it's a project that I think is important and needed for our time. And so I think I really was excited to see Emerge doing that at this event. And I'm assuming it's been doing that in the past events in Europe. And so for me, I really enjoyed that part of it. And I felt there were some aspects of it that worked well. For me, some of the things that were challenges, one, for the facilitation of groups, a lot of us didn't even know that we were named as facilitators of groups. So we had about 5 minutes before hosting the group to huddle and figure out what we want to do. And I found that was the case for a lot of people. And there's something exciting to be on that edge and just see what bubbles up. But on the other hand, to me, having a little bit more time to be mindful about what you want to do so that you can set the right kind of container, it might have been more productive of coherence and contact and meeting if there had been a little bit more preparation time possible among the organizers or the facilitators of each of those events. I appreciated what Nomali said also about kind of feeling like the integral old timer at the event. I also felt that. And, we were hosting one group on lessons from the integral past. And so it was an interesting thing to reflect on, but also I felt a little uneasy about it because it looked like we were speaking about, okay, what was tried and failed and no longer relevant, but might have something to seed whatever this new thing is. And it's like, I haven't quite let go of the promise of integral. So that was a curious place to sit in. I think overall, I really liked the open-ended experiment. I would have liked a little bit more prep time or structure without killing the jazz-like spirit of the overall event. Looking at past integral theory conferences, and thinking about what Roger also shared about having a few presentations, because the integral theory conferences in the past did feature these kinds of, facilitated, dialogical circles where there's open process, and there were some presentations and people moved between that. And I think a little bit more of that could have helped this event to provide, I think, a little bit more sense of a shared meaning space and compass points, orienting compass points, so that we could get a better sense of the tribes that are here and the projects that are here and the perspectives that are intersecting. So I don't know, it doesn't mean that the Emerge event needed to do that, but I think there's something to be said for events which do have a little bit more, didactic presentation, as well as process and dance and play and all the other things that happened. So that's where I'll leave it. I think, Elin, is the sense of the question pretty clear for this round?
If you could repeat the question, that would be wonderful. I get a sense of it from your response, but that would still be lovely. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, it's just asking, from your own experience and background with these kinds of events, your own knowledge of fostering intersubjective emergence and building bridges and possibly, bringing collective intelligence together for innovation, all of those kinds of things. What do you feel worked well for this event, and what do you feel didn't work so well or needs, maybe some tinkering in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Bruce. With regards to what went well, I think a lot went well. I think there was such a fascinating amalgamation of individuals present. And so I think they did a good job in curating the attendees and the attendee list. I think that given the limited resources with which they were working, I again, while there were a lot of different issues with the venue, I thought that their selection of the venue and, the opening ceremony and the party and, many different aspects, the food, just like from an event, like a former event planning perspective, I think there were many elements of the event that went well. And given, again, the limited resources with which they were working, not just financially, but time-wise, everyone had many other obligations. I thought they did a great job with what they had. However, I echo Brendan's critiques. So Brendan Graham Dempsey, is an individual in our space who has a YouTube channel, but also has a Facebook group called Meta Modern Spirituality. And he recently published an essay with his thoughts on the conference. And part of his feedback was that he felt the event had been, hijacked by postmodernism. He and there was one other individual whose name is not coming to me right now, but I tend to agree with that. It wasn't simply present in the closing ceremony, which I responded to. There was also another, there were other occasions where I attempted to interact with people, and without them knowing anything about me, really, they had just met me seconds prior. There were like a lot of projections, a lot of shaming and guilting that I have definitely experienced in spaces, that are heavily postmodern or green. But I was not anticipating experiencing at a meta-modernist conference or at the Emerge conference. And so I'm not sure, because I know that part of their goal was to be very inclusive in terms of people from a wide range of backgrounds, in terms of ethnicity, gender, nationality, and perspectives. And so I think that there is maybe some work to be done to make sure that we are both prioritizing inclusivity while making sure that people are aligned with the goals and the mission and the ideology of the conference, because that, I think it really impacted the container on multiple levels. And so part of the reason that I don't think it was that we were ultimately successful in reaching the goal stated at the beginning of the conference was because of the dynamics I just mentioned, was partly due to the dynamics I just mentioned, and then partly due to the facilitation, which many people have already addressed. And so not simply the fact that they told you, I didn't realize that it was that hastily organized, but that's definitely not an ideal way to manage facilitators. So obviously that is something that could be shifted, but also it just felt, again, I could sense that there was some way in which the resources available were not adequate for the task at hand. So I'm Ēlen and I'm complete.
I appreciate that, Elin. And that's actually a perfect segue, because that's the next, maybe a little bit more controversial question I wanted to ask. But given, especially on the WhatsApp thread that Layman started, which is still going strong and people still reflecting and processing on the event, Brendan's article was pretty well received there overall. Some pushback, but it was pretty well received. But it sparked a lot of thought and question and reflection on this issue of there being possibly different, cultural codes, different memetic orientations, all gathered in one place. And on the one hand, it's a good thing. Metamodernism and integral and Game B, they all have to learn how to work. If we want to make any really lasting change in the society, we have to learn how to work together, especially with modernists and postmodernists, also traditionalists. So we do need to be able to coordinate in some way. And I think that's a valuable experiment that we just got to keep throwing ourselves into in some way. And on the other hand, I appreciate what Brendan said, and I do think it tended to sometimes derail or hijack conversations, and that is the memetic splits between the different groups. And if we really do see it as modernist, postmodern, and metamodern or integral kind of basic orientations, I did feel the some of the dynamics that typically have been undermining in the past of events, especially by postmodern shaming and the different dynamics that we all know well. So one of my questions here is, to what extent did everyone see that and in their own experiences there? And, you know, how do we hold that? How do we handle that? Was it wrong in the event to have all of those memetic groups included, or is that something unavoidable and we just need to find ways to work with that? Because I think maybe you were thinking about Josh, Elin, Josh Leonard and Brendan have both been talking about that in terms of, you know, we've got, in some sense, an emerging set of languages, but they can be picked up by people from multiple worldviews and used in different ways. So it's not always easy to tell until you're actually in the interpersonal dynamics where people are really coming from as they're holding and deploying those ideas and tools. But I think it did become apparent for a number of us in conversations which may have imploded at some point. So yeah, just would be interested in your overall reflection of the kind of the inner memetic dynamics and how to handle that.
Well, Brendan and I sat together on a plane for 3 hours and then spent 2 more hours at the Chicago airport. So a lot of what's in his article is the stuff that we went over together. So I'm largely in agreement with it. I think, I mean, like I mentioned before about Emerge has to simultaneously be self-refining and outward facing. It's got to bring those two things together, especially because going forward, there's going to be this relationship between the kinds of communities we're trying to generate and the people who are exerting influence in the world. Right? So that's going to be an absolutely necessary tension for us to work with. But I think one of the difficulties was that a lot of people weren't necessarily expecting that, right? That there was a lot of postmodern energy one way or another. And that if we'd been a little more prepped for it, if we'd known that was the mission to run interface between those things, we might have been able to handle that a little bit more competently. I think a lot about meta-progressivism, right? And sort of like, how do we make postmodernism better? How do we make it a better version of itself? But that's a special task, and you have to like be in the right mood to be able to handle that. And I'm not sure we were all prepped for that to be the mood. I think there's also a lot of sometimes things look like it's levels or cultural codes, and it's really just a bunch of differences between the meta-modern integral field itself. There's a lot of internal subdivisions and tensions that might need to have more of their own space. And Emerge has been a really good container, but I think it's getting to the spot where there's so many interesting things swirling around in this hive that it's going to break out a little bit. I had a great discussion with Jonathan Rowson yesterday. His idea is there could be 5 of them. I think there's some consensus building around having a Toronto and a Ukraine next time, to have 2 of them moving toward 5. And I think people who are thinking in that direction are sensing that there's a lot of, not that it's problematic that there's a lot of divergences within the field, because it doesn't have to cohere strongly. But there's a lot of potential now for people to try different flavors of it, and that each of those attempts could privilege slightly different types of people and see how they want to run forward with this project.
I could
one more thing is,
oh, sorry.
The WhatsApp group that I set up, I really appreciated the opportunity that gave certainly myself and some other people to work out who you actually wanted to have a conversation with, whether that was inside the gathering or outside the gathering. And to Ivo's point about everybody determining their own sense of success, I think the people who were more proactive who decided what they wanted from it and were able to use tools like that to get into the conversations they wanted to have, that they're walking away from this with a very strongly positive feeling that might not be the case for people who sort of just went along with the event and were exposed to it semi-passively. Go ahead, Namali.
Yeah, that rings very true for me, for sure. Thanks for voicing, like you gave words to, I think, what I was experiencing. So I think one of the reasons why I was interested in joining this conversation isn't so much to critique necessarily this Emerge conference that happened, which by and largely was just really wonderful. But I think what is interesting for me about this whole conversation is really that for some of us who've been doing these kinds of events for, in my case, 20 years or so now within the sort of the integral context, is there's nothing necessarily new about the challenges that we might have encountered at the Emerge conference. Just this sort of the third attractor space is going to, by default, attract the other attractors, the first and the second. So I think that the continuing challenge and conversation for me would be around this polarity, this sort of the challenge of the coincidentia oppositorum constantly, which is, how do we play with the polarity? How do we dance with the polarity of being decentralized, which was a word that came up a lot during this Emerge conference, this decentralization. But I think if we are only focusing on decentralization to the neglect of also having some level of centralized, effortful, concentrated, focused, cohesive something that is the third attractor, I think that we're going to continue to run into this problem of where there is a lot of decentralization, there is a lack of leadership per se, that centralized entity. And that can easily, I think, go into a puddle of that postmodern swamp messiness. Again, nothing wrong with that, because I do think that is the biggest homework for the third attractor integral meta-modern community is to figure out how do you really attend to postmodern cultural creatives, let me put it that way, without getting our blood boiling often or feeling like I'm just going to pack my bags and leave. And by the way, not because of anything to do with postmodernity or the postmodern, whatever happened there. I remember somebody sent me an email saying, so how's the Metamodern conference going? Have you arrived? I said, yes, this was Saturday. And my response was, it's good. And it's surprisingly postmodern. This was my response. And I will also confess, I actually, by Saturday evening, having attended the morning and the afternoon of the facilitated circles, by Saturday evening, I was clear that I'm not entirely sure what the here is, or what the there it was. So I actually changed my flight. I actually managed to jump on a flight and get back to Colorado earlier. I left around 11, 12 noon, which was, I didn't wait for the end of the conference actually. And I felt fine about it. I wasn't leaving angry or anything like that. It was just fine. I just kind of felt like I'm sort of done, I think. I'm at peace with that. It's been lovely to meet some wonderful people. I especially I think, anyway, yeah. So for me, this conversation, this challenge of how do we innovate, expand as the sort of this loosely constructed meta-modern integral third attractor community, how do we really focus on that? Because it has a lot of incredible gifts to offer the challenges of the world, the meaning crisis and whatever, however we want to see that the challenges are real. And there are lots of wonderful gifts that the third attractor can bring to the struggles. However, I think this innovation, expansion, a lot of people in the same room, different stages, different ideologies. That decentralization is a good thing, but I think we really have to work on the centralized piece. How do we do that? What is that centralized piece of the puzzle? Who's the leader of that? Is there a headquarters of that? Where is that located? So, I would be really interested in kind of wondering, what is that? And again, I'm not saying that there needs to be this like the United Nations of metamodern, but also not necessarily saying that we don't need that.
I'd like to respond. Nomali, I'm not responding to your question, Bruce, but I would like to respond to Nomali. Is that okay? Great. So yeah, that feels so resonant because part of my experience there was a profound sense of ungroundedness. And of course, there were many different factors that contributed, everything from, the really high ceilings and the poor acoustics in the Austin Central Library to many of us had really unpleasant travel experiences on our way there because of, challenges at the Austin airport. But then also it was, I think for me, part of that sentiment, that somatic experience was what you're pointing to, that there doesn't seem to be any sort of centralization. It just seems like a bunch of floating orbs. And so I think part of the difficulty in utilizing the tremendous gifts, the tremendous sacred gifts inherent in the solutions, right, that we have created, as well as, the individuals, is because I don't know if it's that people are not communicating with one another. I don't know if it's because I'm fairly new to the space. It's been less than 5 years, because there are all kinds of schisms of which, I'm not aware of, which can happen in any kind of intellectual or political movement. Or if it's because maybe people feel allergic to, I would imagine they don't feel allergic to hierarchy, because that's usually something more in the postmodernist stage of development. But, I'm not sure. But in general, I felt like very disoriented. And I think that part of the antidote to that is that we could benefit from sort of centralization. And even if it's just a working group, right, of individuals who are representing the various streams of consciousness in the space, I think even something like that, where people are meeting once a month, but regularly and consistently and in a very committed fashion, and having a real strategy, like something as simple as that could really have a major impact on our trajectory, on our ability to accomplish our goals and help provide solutions to the meta crisis. I'm Elin and I'm complete.
That's wonderful, Elin, and you've got a knack for anticipating where I want the flow to go. So it's thank you. It's wonderful. I wanted to ask if Roger or Ivo has anything you'd like to share on the question about any of the memetic Vimy tensions that were present and manifesting, and then I'd like us to begin to look at what do we think are right steps for where to go next in terms of herding these cats.
Sure, Bruce. Yeah, I can add a few things. I did research actually into the emerge field after the 2019 gathering to see like who was in the room. Jonathan Rowson asked me this when it became more clear that emerge was being handed over to Perspectiva as sort of the social movement project. And historically, it's been the convening power of Thomas Björkman. It started small in Berlin, and then later out, these gatherings became bigger and bigger and bigger. So part of the method of how we get people together here was already a bit more of a decentralized way of getting people in. So some, let's call them tribal leaders, were given invitation powers to each invite maybe 10 to 20 people. And that's kind of how this one came together. So it was less Thomas source energy. However, like these fault lines, if whatever you want to call them, it seemed to me coming back and back again. Also, as I understand some of the struggles that Integral over the years had to deal with. Didn't go to your session. Maybe this was talked about. Like, do we lead with spirituality? Or do we really go and focus on building structures, institutions? I mean, I think to some extent we all suffer from some kind of quadrant absolutism, as I think Wilbur termed it. You know, to me, for example, the upper left is quite salient. I have a strong spiritual practice background, but I also am aware of this, so I can kind of like see how does all this fit together. But to just name a couple of these fault lines, in this research that surfaced from this research I did following the Kiev gathering. And one was, for example, the masculine and the feminine, you know, the thinkers and the doers, quite low level of tolerance by like people with like a high action bias that actually like have high agency and know how to actually produce, you know, tangible results in the world, who mostly live through strategy. Others come at it through culture. You know, they kind of want to first lead with culture. And actually, this is like important part of the source code for Emerge and its purpose. Normally, you said like, well, we need some kind of centralization. Historically, and in the tribe, this happens usually through charismatic individuals. So the hope is also that we can start to cohere around a set of principles, a set of ideas that we want to know, of course, about each other and inform each other from this recognition that we're each biased, you know, quadrant absolutism, one such a lens of sense making for these types of biases that we have. But let me see. Yeah. So, you know, the people, as I understand it, this was also a major fault line in the early Game B community. Some really want to start focusing on inner development, and this is the way to actually affect change and social change. Others said, no, we're going to politics. We're going to build a political party. We're going to build institutions. So this is still underneath the surface, you know, these deeper kind of lines of where we believe the biggest leverage points are when we're thinking about social change and impact. And each of the tribe, of course, think they have they should be grabbing the ring of power to some extent. So, yeah, I think going forward into the space, we need to look at what are these deeper inquiries around love and power, for example, you know, things that we are throughout our personal history, and everybody kind of needs to find these out on the outside. So if only a little bit can start to be reoriented within the people who want to act upon the world, like really strongly through their projects, like go a little bit more inside and actually practice and work with this a little bit more. And the people who are actually coming from this like hugely spiritual place that says love is all we need, or culture of like strong bonds is all we need, look, get a bit more practical, get a bit more, you know, maybe less hard and a bit more mind. So I think there's just a lot of rebalancing work to be done, both in the system but also in the personal and the interpersonal. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm complete, I guess.
And I can be very brief. There's been quite a bit said, but first off, I just want to make sure that there's a huge thank you expressed to the organizers, because there's so much work to create a conference like this and so much reaching out to pull such an amazing group of people together. And the issue of speaking across different, quotes, memetic tribes is both the challenge and the opportunity of a gathering like this. And it's inherent in bringing people of different worldviews and different perspectives and approaches together. And so that's the beauty and the challenge. And a couple of thoughts come to mind. I remember, and so much of what we're talking about here is a question of balance. You know, what's the optimal balance for effectiveness? And of course, different people have different ideas. And I remember there are two things coming to mind. One is my first retreat that I ever went to with Ram Dass, and I still remember something he said, which was, balance is a magic word on the path. And it's like, and it's a polarity. It's not something you ever solve once and for all. It's an ongoing issue of finding the appropriate balance now and now and now. So it's always going to be with us. So that's one thing. And another is all these different priorities of what should be done and where should we go. We're reminded of the line from Aldous Huxley's utopian novel Island, where the stranger comes to the utopia and asks, well, where do you start? And they respond, we start everywhere at once. And we're going to need a lot of different approaches, and there's no one full answer, and no one has it all. So we're going to need each other, and hopefully this kind of coming together can be a mutually catalytic conversation and gathering an event, such as the bringing of us together. Again, what a gift to have met each of you at this conference. So yeah, maybe that's enough.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And I know some of the attendees here, we don't all have the same amount of time available, so I don't want to take this too long. But I think the next thing that we could look at, because we're already kind of leaning in that direction, and I want to say a couple things. One, I mentioned at the beginning, the harvesting is not done yet. That's just about to really start to unfold. So the whole reflection on what do we take from this and where can we go next, I imagine is just about to get going in terms of, what's going to be happening in the organized events. And so again, just calling this forward here as a little tributary stream for that movement that I think is about to unfold. And I don't have a history with the past Emerge events, so I don't know what the balance has been, in terms of what's been emphasized or tried or not. I'm new to my exposure to this kind of event and Emerge's project. But just thinking about what we saw gathered and highlighted and the potentials that were illuminated through Tomas's speech and some of the different conversations that we had in our different places, what do you think really should happen as the right momentum, as whatever momentum was built up at the event? Where should we be, how can we most fruitfully capitalize on the connections and the momentum and some of the rifts and tensions that we discovered towards, fruitful outcomes that will really serve, I think, overall the shared interests. And, one of my questions is, do we have events like this that really focus so broadly on the broad meta crisis with all the different things that are confronting us? Or do we begin to focus more on targeted issues and problems and really have more time that could be spent in particular areas? Because my sense at the conference was we got a good sense of the problem space and the potential space. We both had a broad picture of the problem space that was highlighted there in terms of all the different issues and challenges people are looking at, and the great potential that's in this collection of tribes in terms of the different gifts that people bring. But there wasn't enough time at any point to really go very far in any one of those areas. So for me, I'm feeling, what could we do next that really can channel in some fruitful ways? So I'm interested overall in your sense of what's next based on what you've experienced here at the Emerge gathering.
Well, I mentioned this idea of going to 2 emerges and then to Jonathan's 5 emerges. And I think there's something like that that's going to be a part of this going forward, of being able to sample it in different ways. But I also have a bunch of thoughts in my mind from everything I've just heard from everybody for the last little while here. I think some of the quadrant prioritization issues might get solved if we put activities and projects in the foreground rather than discussion. Right? That when you have projects, I'm half jokingly referring to it as let's build a barn. But if you come around to do that, you can still have all the intellectual and emotional and spiritual discussions. But if you come to have spiritual and intellectual discussions, you don't necessarily get any actual activity and coordination done. So that might be a thing to prioritize in order to get that balance we were talking about. I was thinking about, Namali leaving early. And certainly I had such a good Saturday myself that when I went back out to the Wild Vessel Ranch, where a number of us were staying, we decided the next morning, we're not going to the second day of the conference. We'll drop in, but we really want to take this energy and hold it and use this opportunity in Austin to have the discussions we really want to have. And when we did come into the conference, what I found myself doing was, as I've done with you, Bruce, a little bit, is say, hey, we need to prioritize eldership here, right? And so it's one thing to jokingly say we're old timers, but it's another thing to say this is a really important role. If we're going to move this forward, if there's some way to centralize this without necessarily having a fixed common language, without necessarily having a leader, then we need some tribe-like structures to anchor it and give us a coordinating function. And some of those may resemble classical tribal structures. Right, so it may be that there's slightly different male-female roles. It may be that there's eldership apprentice roles. It may be that there's some kind of ritual enactment that's needed. But some of those anchoring structures may be the thing that gives us the effective centralization while maintaining the decentralized capacity we're moving toward. And I think a lot of that, like with all tribal formation, has got to come from the unconscious. And one of the weaknesses I saw is that in trying to generate we spaces, we focus very much on asking the frontal part of the mind. You know, what's your name? Where are you from? What book did you read? Rather than, hey, tell me something you don't understand about yourself, right? There's the ability to express from the unconscious, and also, like Ēlen was pointing to, the ability to analyze the unconscious, because there are a lot of projections moving around. There is a lot of shadow work to be done, and that should be encouraged. Otherwise, it kind of becomes a sticking point. Moving forward, you know, when I came out of this conference, I went to the Ontario Depth Adaptation Gathering, and then I spent some time in Toronto with the Integral Leadership crew. And there's a bit of a consensus building there about, if we do an Emerge Toronto, what we want it to be like, right? So Eric and Natasha and Jeremy and Turquoise working with Brandon, trying to figure out what that flavor is. But that flavor doesn't have to be the flavor of all Emerge going forward. It's something to try. Right, that we're going to maybe privilege a little more Indigenous, a little more energy sensitive, a little more shadow work or something like that, put different people in the deciding positions. That's great, but it's only great as an experiment. We have to be trying it in a number of different ways, and all of those ways have to be expected to have some of the incoherence and tension and unpredictability and unsatisfactoriness that all of these things are going to have. So that's my sense of it.
And Layman, I'll just add a counterpoint, because you listed a number of kind of psychological, spiritual growth work things. And one thing we haven't mentioned about this, the Emerge gathering, there was a lot of process, both in group, at the group and even large group level. And I found myself sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm back in a California process group. I've been doing these for 40 years. So I wanted the other side. But let's acknowledge, you can't make all the people happy all the time. And so different people come with different things. And I could appreciate that for maybe the activists, the philosophers, a lot of this kind of experiential stuff was maybe quite new. I don't know, maybe so. And so go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. It seems like you weren't finished, Roger. No worries.
No, well, just to respond to Bruce's question about what's next, I think probably need to acknowledge that there are multiple levels of what's next on the large group Emerge organization level. Yeah, I think that'll be up to individual groups, such as you were describing happening in Toronto, Layman, and we'll see. One thing that will certainly come out, I think, is coming out in this very moment, is the value and the ongoing value and fruitfulness of the individual connections we made. You know, this is happening because we met there, and I'm just delighted. So that for me is just, that's invaluable. And then there's the possibility of other shared projects will emerge, and I think that remains to be seen. I think I want to add just one more thing, and that is that there's a risk in these groups. And I was surprised. I was one of, I have some COVID risks, but I was one of only about half a dozen people, and over 100 people wearing a mask there. And I know some people have gotten COVID from it, and I don't know how many, but there are risks in this time. So it's an unfortunate thing. And you can't make, you can't make people do any one particular approach in one particular way. And everyone has their different style, but it was, for me, being there was a balance of the enormous attraction of being with people like you and others and meeting people, and the fact that this is a risk. And yes, we did have a COVID outbreak, and I don't know how far it's gone.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I thought that I did come back with COVID, but turned out I didn't. So luckily I didn't get COVID, but I still got something else. But anyway, something about, I had something to say about COVID and it just left my trail of thought. I'm not sure if, Layman, this is what you were talking about when you were talking about 5 different events or something, but it may not be the same thing. Something looking to the future. I might really like to bring the sense of hierarchy into how events are done, in the sense of what if the next emerge or next any of these events are developmental, in the sense that perhaps it's a commitment of 3 events. It's like going to a Vipassana retreat. The first 3 days you are taught just to concentrate on labeling and your breath, and that's it. And then the next several days, there's Vipassana, insight begins to emerge. So in that way, I would love to imagine that someday in the future, when we commit to coming together with some amount of seriousness to attend these kinds of events, that we don't necessarily have to have a goal per se. Again, it's the dance of the polarities. Have some amount of goal, but also some amount of allowance to emerge, for emergence to just happen. But that it is a commitment of maybe a minimum of 3 events, that on the first event, we commit to doing certain things, getting to know each other. And then at the second event, that evolves, that intention, that goal, the whatever is produced, the outcomes continue to evolve. And then at the last one, maybe there is something to show for and something to plan for whatever is next then. So, transcend, include, anticipate. I'm also thinking about in terms of like Ravikian teachings. Something is of relevance at the center of this, the third attractor as the relevance or the belief system or the action that we're after. I think, again, developmentally speaking, we can really start to pay attention to what different things are producing this thing of relevance that we're trying to create, and what are its uses. So John Vervaeke talks about how if you have many, many ways in which whatever is relevant has been produced, but then the outcomes, the way that it is being used is only just 1 or 2 different ways. Well, I started a blog and maybe I showed up on a podcast. Well, that's called trivial. That's triviality when it comes to sort of relevance realization and really doing something of value with our beliefs and our action in the world. If we don't have too many origination points from which our thing of relevance has come into being, but we are doing too much with whatever that relevance point is, it's far-fetched. That's when we are kind of stuck in our own confirmation bias. And so I think that I like that model that gives us a sense of balance. It's like whatever we're trying to create, how can we really pay attention to creating a good balance for the problem space of how is what we're trying to create produced? How many different ways that are valid sources of insight or origination should we look at? And then is it balanced in the way that our outcomes are actually creating something for the world, in the world, for ourselves, out there? So
everything everything all of you have shared thus far feels very resonant, but particularly the last piece, Nomali's recommendation that there be some kind of like a 3 stages of interaction. I think the only thing I would add to that is that maybe it doesn't have to be in person. So for instance, part of the reason that the conference was a success for me is because throughout the pandemic, I spent countless hours on Clubhouse with the Integral Leadership Review team. And we really became a community, right? So I don't think, even if it were something, like a 3-day conference, but a loosely based one on Clubhouse, where there would be breakout rooms and people could hang out and do different things if they didn't want to be in the main room where people, where we were having talks. So basically that there would be, I'm just using Clubhouse as a possibility. That doesn't have to be the platform where we do it. But my main point is that it can be done virtually, which then minimizes the cost and minimizes the risks posed by COVID, as Roger mentioned, and probably takes a lot less effort. And so part of what's coming up for me is that to maintain the momentum, I think the larger conferences and having more Emerge gatherings is essential, but also in the interim, there are smaller things that we can do. It doesn't have to be like a grand production, because sometimes that can feel overwhelming or unrealistic. And so that's really the only thing that I have to add at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, I guess closing remarks on the question of what is next. Well, practically, a few people have stepped forward and said they want to do local events. It's about 6-7 people who are interested in just getting together locally, and I think that's really wonderful and also quite important. And in terms of this question of centrality, hierarchies, vertical, horizontal. I don't have the answer there, although I do think it's important to, we're all about the connections, obviously, and we're all about the cohering and we finding the other. It feels really good. But I think the success may just as well really depend on it, to what degree do we actually also nurture our separateness? The distance, so we just don't cohere prematurely into groupthink, lack of depth there. I mean, some things really die because of too much light sometimes. I love the idea, Layman, of building a barn. Many people are always calling for it needs to be more embodied, but I love cohering, I love bonding with people over just grabbing a huge log and putting it on your shoulder and carrying it from A to B. To me, that is something that I really like, instead of always having to, cohere around ideas, let's say, and in which you also actually easily fracture, right? So there is something, I think, that if we look at what can be done, I do believe there is a hierarchy of culture, vision, and strategy, and that strategy actually comes last, and maybe we shouldn't even really talk about it for a while, although some projects that I think we've yet to identify that we all in this space agree lifts all boats, but that neither of us individually or our organization can undertake an initiative and initiate and actually execute. So if we identify these few things that these all boat lifting kind of projects, then that would be interesting to see. And then lastly, Emerge, it has this local feel, it's going to look very different in Kiev, next year, if we really manage to kind of get it off the ground there. It's going to be very, very, very different from what we just experienced a couple of weeks ago, and rightly so. So this connection to context and to the local, and what it actually means for the whole, how that information, how these learnings funnel back into the superstructure, let's say, and how that co-shapes that, from the US, from Europe, possibly, who knows, Taiwan is some part of me is thinking that could be a really interesting space to have one, for example, Asia. So these are some closing remarks, I guess, from me. So I'm going to go and join a party that I've been running late. So thank you all for this conversation. It's been great meeting you, and looking forward to actually, seeing the harvesting, as you mentioned, Bruce, what that actually yields. So thanks for listening, and hope to see you guys again soon.
I just had one little quick thing, which I lost in my train of thoughts earlier around COVID when Roger was talking about location, venue. I think next time maybe pay a little more attention to like not having a summer event in Austin, Texas, where it's 106 degrees. You can't enjoy you just cannot really relax. And during the pandemic, we should have had a venue that allowed us to freely be outdoors and, connecting outside in nature more than be stuck in an air-conditioned building all day long, with most of us not wearing masks. And so, yeah, if it's in the winter, don't pick Alaska. If it's in the summer, don't pick Texas.
Here, I agree, Nawali, and also thank you, Ivo. I have, a couple thoughts that are popping up, and I'll bring us towards wrapping up here. One, regarding the masks and regarding what Layman said about eldership, I really would have liked to have seen in that community more respect for the elders present by more caretaking around not spreading COVID. I think that would have been a good thing to see there. One of the reasons that I was invited was for talking about this kind of topic, and it's also something that Layman and I have been exploring in our discussions with John Vervaeke, and that is around collectively processing our grief for the state of the world. With John Vervaeke, we've talked about the grief of God, the grief of the death of God, but also more globally around just the weight of the multiple compounding issues we face. And Joanna Macy has been an inspiration for me in that area, in that she's been very, very active as an activist and on the front line of a lot of global issues. But she found in herself that she lacked resiliency when she didn't allow for the proper feedback of actually feeling where we are existentially. And so I do think something like that would have been nice at this event, or it still could be good as something that branches off from this kind of event. I think collectively as a community, we need to do something like that. And to very practically balance that with something that Roger said, which and Amali said, that there was a surprising amount of postmodern processing and things like that went on here. And I do feel like there needs to be some also practical focusing towards concrete ends. So again, that let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let's do all kinds of things. There's so many ways that we can approach this, and I hope we can just foster that flowering in as many ways as possible. This is our little bud that we're offering to the blooming conversations that happened after the event, and I hope many more follow. I want to thank all of you for joining here. I want to thank the organizers for really overall an extraordinary event and convening so many amazing people. And if there anything anyone would like to offer as a final word, but overall, I just wanted to give my deep thanks and appreciation to everyone here and to the whole event.
I just wanted to share that. So for me, this was my first time meeting a lot of folks who I've been interacting with for a few years in person. Some people I met at Ēlen, or, I lived in San Francisco for many years, so I know them from adjacent communities. But I felt very, very grateful to be in that room and to be finally coalescing. I left feeling inspired and uplifted and really motivated to start putting pen to paper and sharing, what has arisen for me as a result of being in these spaces, as well as communing with the work of various metamodernist thinkers, through my, I would say, at least in this space, I don't know if unusual is the right word, but through my less common lens. So in general, there were just so many wonderful, positive things that came out of it for me, including finding the courage at the very end to name a dynamic that had felt present throughout the weekend and to confront it and say, this is not aligned. You know, if this for me, this does not feel like the way forward. And I've been biting my tongue for a long time. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that there are many people of all backgrounds who are sensing the tremendous polarization, especially in the United States, and who are deeply, deeply concerned, and who are afraid of speaking into that and speaking into how things could be different. And so in general, I'm so glad that I attended. I'm glad that it exists and that it will continue to exist. And my hope is that we can learn from the aspects of the conference that left us wanting, and incorporate them as we move forward. Thank you.
I want to say, Elin, that I really appreciated the courage and the grace with which you stood up and voiced that at the end. That was really appreciated.
Thank you, Bruce.
I appreciate that you brought up the grief question, Bruce. Like you said, we've been standing in front of that as a pondering question with Vervaeke and some others lately. And in the Mapping the Field circle that Turquoise and Joe Lightfoot and I co-facilitated, it was mentioned several times, and Ēlen was there. And I think there's something about the depth of that emotional dissent and heartbreak, which is where the real core of the processing has to go on, so that it doesn't go on at the endless level of trivial discussion processing that Roger was pointing to there being too much of for decades now. I think we all have to let ourselves be a little more frustrated and a little bit more heartbroken, partly in order to get a deeper richness in the field we're looking at, but also to take the world moment seriously. And part of what I'm pointing to with my Let's Build a Barn idea around projects is also that I think we need to be a little bit more down to earth and a little more preparedness oriented in the way we go at these things, because this is a great way to slowly think about how to steer the future. But any number of elements of our civilization could be collapsed or destabilized at any moment. So we have to be really on the ground about that, and we have to be really open to the fact of that destabilization. And that's an emotional thing. That's a deep grief and a deep disappointment that will solve some of that problem for us, but also get us out of the trap of the endless superficial self-processing loop.
I would maybe just add, specifically, I think it's important for me to reiterate that a lot of what I've shared today on this call, as I said earlier, is really around just the general issue of how do these third attractor integral metamodern communities come together, and what is our goal really, what kinds of outcomes we're looking for. So we have many opportunities to kind of meet these challenges. I just want to more specifically about this event say, I just really thought it was really courageous for two Nordic folks to have organized an event that was held in Austin, Texas, for a bunch of North Americans. And there was like Roe v. Wade and all kinds of stuff going on. There was something that was sort of the Nordic, rational, straightforward sort of approach that I really appreciated somehow. So to Pamela and Thomas, I just want to say thank you for that. I really appreciated that. And I just want to say, look at us, we're just still a bunch of dreamers, these crazy people. We're still dreaming, and I say yay to that. Keep doing it.
I just want to say, Namali, one of the things you said here today about the fact that when we organize around the third attractor, we will always attract the other two attractors. That's really staying with me. And I think that's important to remember. And also, I would add that when we do this in Toronto, our odds of being overheated or shot go way down.
Excellent.
Is there anything final that you'd like to say, Roger?
Oh, big thank you. Thank you to thank you to you for bringing us together, and thank you to the people who created Emerge. It's a lot of work, and what a gift.
Definitely. I feel the same deep sense of gratitude and appreciation, and those ripples are still present for me, and I think for many people. So thank all of you for being here. It's been a delight to talk with you today.
Thank you. Likewise. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Station, Bruce and Layman, and for organizing us today. And goodbye, everyone.
Yes, thanks so much.